it Cognitive Physics in the New Horizon of Knowledge, because that's what we're titling this entire enterprise of what we're doing. And this talk is a little different because I am, I'm to some degree an outsider to obviously to the physics community because I'm not a physicist. And I know that IPI is a lot more open-minded about people just presenting things that might have merit, but they don't necessarily have to be scientists. So I see this conversation more like a plea with the larger physics community and, starting from IPI. Because what will be required of me in this conversation, aside from telling you a little bit about the project and, what all the newest things that we know about what I'm doing, it's also to try and maybe push ontology a little bit. And that's always challenging to some degree. So the first thing, maybe a couple of things to say in general about, and these are obviously like super simplified illustrations, but I think they deliver the point. There's a couple of things that I want to say just about world models as a whole, because it's important to the conversation. A lot is being lost in translation when people hear that the experiment requires psychedelics. And the first obvious thing is that people say, well, to anybody who doesn't know, I'm known to be the guy who's saying that I discovered that if you project a diffracted laser on the surface and you smoke DMT, we now know that all tryptamines work, but specifically DMT, it's easier to see. You would see what seems to be some kind of a self-executing code in any surface you project the laser on. And that obviously makes everybody's spidey senses go off the charts. The immediate resistance points are, well, you are on the most psychedelic hallucinogen known to man. What did you expect? Well, let's go through what we should expect. This general illustration is outlined beautifully in Dr. Andrew Gallimore's book, Reality Switch Technologies. He's a computational neuropharmacologist who devoted his life to study psychedelics and specifically DMT. He now stepped away from academia after a few decades in it. He's now considers himself more of a writer. I highly recommend his work to anybody who's technically minded and wants to know a little bit more about, what we do understand about psychedelics from the perspective of neuroscience. And one of the most relevant ideas from his book, I would say, is this, again, super simplified slide that I put in front of you, which is that I'm sure that most of you are aware that the brain is really not a camera. So you don't perceive the world through your eyes like you would perceive it through a camera. It's not that you just collect data on a sensor and it's translated to an image. It goes through a pretty complicated process in which the brain basically compares its guesswork with whatever signals are infringing on it from the outside. Now, we're going to leave aside for a second what that means from the outside, but whatever it is that is happening in the environment is basically sending, wiggles, let's call it. The brain collects these wiggles and it compares it with a very sophisticated guesswork machinery that happens inside. And the main important difference between those two visions of, how the brain works is that you would expect sometimes some departure from what you're seeing from the outside. So right now, if you're looking at the room and nothing happens, basically most things that are happening in the room, the signals are being ignored largely by the brain. It's what you see. If you look at around the room right now, everything you're seeing is your brain guessing the next step. And if you knew all of this, that's wonderful. But I want to drive this point home because that a lot rests on this fact. And if something new happens that disagrees with what the brain thought is supposed to happen, then the brain gets the error and it goes, wait a second, this doesn't match. And then it guesses something adjacently. It says, okay, well, maybe this then? So, it thinks about motion, colors, and then there's a vector map essentially that it kind of guesses through. But what's interesting specifically with DMT, and this is the point that Andrew makes in the book, which is that it's a complete reality switch. It's not like when you do, milder psychedelics and then there's it's almost like the brain is borrowing the environment to do something with. It's not as if the colors jump up or there's some tapestry or some texture that looks a little different. No, we're talking about a complete wipeout of everything you see in front of you, and it's replaced by a completely different world, completely alien to you. And in fact, I would say that the building blocks out of which the qualia is made in these worlds is completely orthogonal to anything you're familiar with. And the problem with that is because we know this fact about the brain, it's very difficult to explain in terms of in neuroscientific terms because the brain is in the business of preserving energy. The brain is not in the business of creating extravagant content on the fly that is super coherent on its own right, behaves by certain rules that you're not familiar with, and yet here it is in front of you, just like the room is in front of you right now. And that is a real conundrum with psychedelics and specifically with DMT. And I'm not going to go into too much details there anymore. If you guys are interested, I highly recommend his book, Reality Switch Technologies. He's a phenomenal writer, and there's a lot of information there that can actually help educate the educated about what we do understand in the modern world about psychedelics and their science. Another point that I want to make that a lot of the arguments would rest on, and this preamble I will take maybe another 2 minutes to do it, and then we'll run through the presentation pretty quickly. I'll leave plenty of room for Q&A because I think that's where really most of the magic is going to be happening. So another interesting thing, this is a study that was done by John Dean in 2019. I mean, he's been working on this for the last few years, but this is a paper he published in 2019 in which he discovered that in rats, just to summarize the key points here, we used to think that DMT is something that we have in trace amounts because we know the body synthesizes it, and most living things that we know of have it. We know our lungs make it. And what's interesting is that we used to think that we have it in trace amounts in key moments in our lives. So right before you die, and some people postulated when you're born. This is why it was dubbed the spirit molecule because of these ethereal connections. But what John Dean discovered is that actually there's many reasons to believe that we have comparable amounts of DMT in our intracranial liquids to other neurotransmitters that we have in pretty substantial amounts during waking hours. So serotonin, dopamine, he basically found that the precursors exist in the same amount in our intracranial liquids and in mammals in general. This is just a little bit more of the graphs of what is actually happening. But essentially, you can see that the spikes that you see, they're basically showing you that the precursors, what actually binds, we have it in comparable amounts to things that then become serotonin and dopamine and things like this, which raises an interesting question of what is it doing in the brain or in our system in such amounts during waking hours. So these two facts, I want you to hold them in front of you because DMT seems to be fundamental in some way, dimethyltryptamine, to something that organisms are doing, and it's not clear what yet. And we do know this fact about, how brain collects information, and the fact that DMT creates such coherent worlds just doesn't map onto what we understand about how the brain gathers information. So most people kind of know this, right? That we're working on a movie and what I'm doing. And if you guys are not familiar, you can check out the Discovery, the trailer, and you kind of get the gist of, the public-facing element of this whole work. Obviously, it's dramatized for the film. I mean, it is kind of wild, to be honest, but still. So that's how some of the presentation we're doing for investors for the film in the beginning. But that's, and I'm putting this in front of you on purpose because this is kind of like, this is what most people, this is the memeable part. DMT lasers, it's wild, it's crazy. And again, it's not wild, but because most people here are scientists, I definitely want to get with you guys to slightly more of what brought me here and what made me actually postulate this as a possibility. and why I think more serious scientists need to pay attention and, maybe even take some of the problems that we're working on. That might be an interesting collaboration there. Um, Again, a little bit more of just the general pitch of what the whole project is about in terms of what we're putting in the movie. So most people think, and this is again a natural thing to go to, they think that kind of the way I arrived at it is that I was walking by a laser one day while I was on DMT. I haphazardly saw some code and immediately concluded it would live in a simulation. Of course, this is very far from the truth, but it truly is how most people perceive. And I'm not even saying people in the public. Some of the criticism that is hurled at me from the scientific community is along those lines, and without really having a conversation with me or asking me, they just kind of assume that that's the case, and they run very far with it. And it would save them a lot of hours and headache if they would just ask me directly exactly what happened there. And that's what I want to convey to you today. So, what actually happened, I'm going to condense a 10-year story to hopefully 15 minutes, and then again we can get to the question part. I am, and I'm saying this with not from a boasting position, just it's relevant to the story. I probably am one of the most experienced psychonauts on planet Earth. I don't know if the most. That's very hard to say. I met some people who are really out there, but I started doing psychedelics when I was very young, for various reasons. I was a pretty wild kid. I think I did dropped acid when I was like 11, which actually doesn't really help my story much, but that's the truth. And I've been exploring these things for decades. I'm now 42, so you do the math, right? I have 30 years of experience with these things. And I always loved it. There's something about my brain that just connects to these things in a way that I really enjoy the wild nature of it, of how far you can explore your mind, and just the fact that it's so real. And that question, obviously, I'm not the only one who asking this question. This is a question that reverberates throughout all psychedelic users around the world, which is, hold on, is all of this real? As in, the content that we see on psychedelics, especially on DMT, is it actually real? And then, some people bite the bullet here and they would start having these philosophical uh, conversations about, like, what do you mean by real? Well, I'll define it for you. What I mean by real is existing on its own side, even when you're not looking. That's what I mean by real. Is it real in that way? Does it have autonomy, just like you do? And then when I had a certain set of experiences that basically started about 10 years ago, that it went, if it even makes sense to somebody who'd never done psychedelics, but it went even more real than what you usually experience on psychedelics. It became like real life for me. It basically became just like if you put Apple Vision Pro right now, augmented reality like that, it became like that for me. Like it became so real that it was just unshakably real. And then I asked myself, well, hold on. Well, how can we determine if it's real? And that's a real conundrum, because most of the questions of this kind quickly, it has a half-life and it quickly decays to an adjacent question, which is, can I explain it away by assuming that the brain is doing it somehow? And I would submit to you, I had a slide for it, but I removed it to the end because I felt it was already getting too long. I would submit to you that this question is actually a bad question. It's not a good question. If you ask, can I explain this in terms of the brain just doing something? It's a bad question because even though it is an ongoing debate whether the brain is Turing complete or not, I would say that the brain is clearly powerful enough for us to understand that the answer to the question whether we can explain it in terms of the brain doing something is almost always yes, which means it's an infinitely elastic question. So it's not really a good way to discern the reality of the situation. So my question was, how? How can we actually determine? Can we at all? And if yes, how can we go about this? And then I started asking myself, okay, what do I know for sure? And some things became very clear to me. So like I said, okay, so if the space is actually real, if in fact is real, And it's a big if, right? Maybe it's not. But if it is real, existing on its own side, well then, first of all, I know I'm seeing it with my eyes, so light must be involved somehow, right? If the space is real, it must have rules, just by definition. Otherwise, there's no distinction between it and just an anthropic soup, and everything is just, if you want to talk about Boltzmann brains and things like this, okay, but that's, it's not what we're interested in terms of the things that we can actually measure and test for. And I know it has to have a topology, and because it seems to be the case that even if the space, if you want to postulate that it's infinite in some way, still sometimes we see it and sometimes we don't see it. So there's some kind of a something we break through, some veil, right? And then the last question that was there was, is there a point at a boundary of it that it would appear the same for everybody? Because people come back from stories from psychedelic spaces, and they report similar things sometimes. But I would say that even those stories can easily be explained away in terms of archetypical structures in the brain, or maybe the architecture of the brain is similar enough at a certain level of emergence to which you can say, well, you saw this being and somebody else saw this being. Well, it's just a representation of this very deep archetypical informational structure that all human minds contain. I can totally see how these arguments would run through if you don't want to buy the story. So I understood that in order to answer this question with any amount of seriousness, we would actually have to look at physics, not so much just at people's experience. So I started going in that direction. And like I said, I'm condensing a 10-year story here for you in a few minutes. So I'm jumping here. And after I made this decision, I basically started exploring the DMT space every single day for, I think, a year plus. I was basically just living on it. I would go to the gym, to the store, I would work, I would do everything, not recommended, by the way, but I would literally do everything on it because my exploration was so realistic. I was exploring the world anew, again, through the lens of DMT, wanting to see if there's any things during our day to day that everybody are missing, because obviously nobody's crazy enough to just live on DMT every day. And I have to be honest, there was not much that I've gathered from this period. So, to anybody who was wondering, no novel new ideas came out of it, aside from the fact that it became more and more salient to me that whether the space is real or whatever my brain was doing was outside of what you would consider even the norm in psychedelic experiences. And that by itself was interesting to me. Because if my brain learned how to interact with these molecules in this new way of some sort, that by itself was interesting to me. I then started reading online as a side note that actually there are these cases where people have these like ultra mega super realistic experiences with these substances, more than the usual. Let's just call it that. In fact, I always tell the story because it was always funny to me. I found this story about this therapist from Florida who a very similar thing happened to him, and he started basically, he got aliens visiting him, talking to him through DMT, and he actually stopped working and started just smoking DMT every day. Kind of very similar. I didn't stop working, but he literally dropped everything. And it ended up with the fact that it ended up with him needing to go to a shrink himself, who told him, listen, you're not talking to aliens. You got to stop doing this. But there were others. And I said, well, this is crazy. Like, how are we not talking about this? So fast forward quite a bit. Some of my ideas came from just very rudimentary understanding I had of physics, which of course is nowhere near on the level of a physicist, but I knew enough. I had enough of an intuition. I grew up, my grandfather was a physicist. I grew up with this. I actually started, I was on my way to in a special program from a young age to kind of complete my bachelor's in physics before I turned 18. And I just then turned the corner in a different way, decided not to go through it. But there was enough of an education in me to kind of know some basic rudimentary things in physics. And I started asking myself in terms of, okay, if this space is real and it exists in some kind of a subspace or a parallel universe or whatever else this might be, how can we potentially interact with this thing? Because clearly when I'm smoking DMT, if it's real, it's coming to me somehow. I'm flooded with this information. And if the information is real, then where's the information coming from? How is it moving into my space as before it wasn't available to me? Is it always available to me and I'm just not seeing it? What changes in my brain that allows me to see it? What is that valve? And all of these questions were kind of hovering. So I knew that, again, light had to be involved, topology, all that stuff. And then I thought, well, wait a second. I do know that, at least to the mind of some physicists, uh, specifically, I was thinking about David Deutsch, and I understand that for some physicists, for some reason, he's a contentious figure. But for all intents and purposes, he's not alone. There are definitely some physicists who entertain seriously, the many worlds interpretation. And the idea there is that there's an instance which is a similar quality that quantum computers utilize, whereas you control the coherence, and then you allow for controlled decoherence to occur when you're actually trying to do the classical calculation. Now, I know that we probably might have some experts here, and you might have some things to say about the specifics of this, and of course I understand and welcome it. But that was the general intuition, which is there has to be some instance in which information, at least one bit of information, could travel between the worlds in some form, and somehow DMT opens the window for that. Again, there was a lot of ifs, of course, and this can hardly be described as a methodology. But the fact that I'm not a scientist and I'm not in academia and I don't have to worry about what I say to anyone, and the fact that I get to play this game for the most part with myself in my own head, and I was not under any threat of anybody thinking I'm crazy, so I allowed myself to play that game. And it was one specific evening where I was walking and thinking about this. We're talking years of thought here, yeah? I was reading papers, I was trying to figure out what it might be. Nothing that really came to me. And by the way, yes, I also asked hyperspace itself. I was like, hey guys, can you tell me something, that I can show other people? How do I build a spaceship? And of course, it was never forthcoming. There was never information that was provided in that way. And I'm not really sure what the reason for that is, because at this point, I'm convinced that the space is real. But there's I don't know if it's a rule, or I'm not sure if it's just something they can't do, like it just doesn't work like that. But they, for all intents and purposes, from what I understand, they can't really give you specific information. They can give you general thoughts, directional, like thought directions, but not really giving you specific information. So I was walking in the middle of the night one night, and I was thinking about exactly this. And it was in the middle of the night, and I noticed that the way the light was switching in the stoplight right in front of me looked different to me at the outskirts. So when it would scatter, it would look different with every color. Now here's the interesting part, and this is where I'm gonna ask you for a little bit more flexibility with me here. I understand, and I understood in that moment, that the reason for that, the reasons for this can be numerous. It can be maybe because of the way that the glass sits on each and every one of them, and it might be spun in a different way. It might have something to do with the fact that maybe they use a different kind of glass for each one of the colors. There's many things that can be causing this. But for some reason, in that instance, when I thought that, I said, this is interesting, the scattering of light. The second I thought that, it's almost like somebody grabbed me by the shoulder and went, yes, look there. And this is the part, this is why I'm asking for your flexibility with me, because I have, friends who are scientists. Melvin is one of them. And I have other people who are like, highly in technical, they have high technical skills. And every single person that I told this story in this way, they always unanimously, aside from Melvin, told me, Danny, I love you, but I'm going to give you a piece of advice. You have to remove this part of your story, because it immediately makes me stop listening to you. And I thought, how interesting. Because it's true that this is extremely flimsy, and I'm fully admitting this, because it's not really a A to B to C path that we can show, right? But there's something about intuition when it hits you that hard that I think cannot be omitted from the story. And I think that scientists are actually familiar with this. It's just that the conviction somehow becomes that it's the actual specifics that drive the main progress, which I don't disagree with, but I think it's a relationship between the intuitive and what we then put pen on paper and actually write down in terms of equations so we can actually inculcate the knowledge in a way that others can partake in. And this is why I want to plead with you here, because I understand that this might not fall into the regular scientific method, but the fact that it amounted to something tells me that I am not at liberty to remove this part of the story. So then, and this is the part that I'm getting really actually to my main hidden Trojan horse that I wanted to talk to you today, which is what as I'm evolving with this project, I'm starting to understand more and more. And that led me, that instance of people telling me, you got to remove this from your story, that actually made me think about slightly more interesting, deep philosophical questions about what knowledge is in general and what it actually represents in the universe as a whole. And I'm not going to bore you with specifics here, because I'm sure that most people here are pretty familiar with the philosophy of epistemology. And again, you guys do science on a regular basis, so I'm not here to educate anyone, but I just kind of want to trace something here so we can assure that we're looking at at least a similar object in our mind's eye. So what is knowledge? So obviously, you can define it in so many different ways. But I think that these five stand out for me as to be pretty universally true. And, if there's contentions here, I would love to hear them. I would say that you can define knowledge as information that can do work. It's responsible for increasing integrity of structure. So in general, like if the more accurate the knowledge that is instantiated in any structure, a building, a rocket, whatever it is that's supposed to do something, it makes its ability to do what it does, in the case of a building to keep standing, in the case of a rocket to get to space, it makes it better at that, right? And more correct knowledge tracks the rules of its environment with high resolution, which is another form of what was said before. Good knowledge reduces error and expands capability, advances towards universality. The more universal it is, the more things it can be applied to. I would say the three central points are kind of saying the same thing in a different way from different domains. But these 2 points, I would say, hold pretty strong, the first one and the last one. So then this is where it gets novel, and I do have some, it is with some trepidation that I'm passing this idea with you guys. So the question for me became, is this the only way that we can talk about knowledge proper? So yes, a lot of scientists are open to the idea that knowledge, we understand the world not just through the modality of science, but in other ways that science can't touch. I'm actually not so sure that that's true. What I'm proposing is that we maybe play with the idea of expanding the definition of what science should be as a whole. And this kind of led me to think about what other domains knowledge can maybe be applied in, and some of them might sound, on the surface of it, a little bit flimsy or out there, but just bear with me on this. So is there such a thing as a spiritual knowledge? Or in other words, is there such a thing as knowledge of the lived experience as it is experienced, but by every being that has such a thing as experience in the universe? And I would say that some of these, we don't have to linger on those, because those are just the things that make sense to me, and I don't have a lot of resting on this, but just as a proposal, maybe one form of spiritual knowledge might be wisdom, which is the lived experience. It's a knowledge that is instantiated in your body. So you live it not through ideas, but you actually understand what's proper according to what you already experienced before. And it's instantiated in your body, that information. Experience which, when instantiated in the physical body, leads to more harmonious states of being. More correct spiritual knowledge tracks the rules of its ethical code with higher resolution. Good spiritual knowledge compresses karmic error and expands capability of being. Universality of spirit, the more universal one's spiritual growth, the more connected one is. And if we have to go into each and every one of those, we can, this conversation is going to be way too long, so I'm just going to leave it here for now. But really, all I want you to follow me along with is the possibility that this might not be metaphorical. Because science, I would say, is the study of, like, the way we define it, is the study of the natural world. But the natural world contains what we're experiencing. That's not something we can eradicate from the equations, even though, well, from the fact about the world, just because we can't put it into the equations. In one of the IPI talks that I was a part of, I was listening to, I forget the name of the guy, brilliant talk. He was talking about, he's a mathematician. And I asked him about whether he has some ways in his models to help inject the observer into the picture. And he really nailed it down, as mathematicians tend to do. He said, "What's the handle?" I said, "He's right. What is the handle?" Because in order to do something with anything in science, you have to have a handle. How do you describe it? How do you put it into symbols? Because otherwise you can't really describe relationships with it, right? But what if, for example, meditation is the science of the inner experience? What is science if not observing something closely, noticing regularities in that thing, communicating these regularities so that others can replicate them? And yes, it wouldn't be as accurate as, creating a device that can do something, but I would say that meditation, that is a practice that is practiced by thousands of people all around the world for eons, is the science of the inner world, specifically in the regard that you can replicate inner states that are along a certain kind of continuum that is actually there. Otherwise, there would not be anything to talk about. And there was already enough data in these slides, and I didn't want to, getting into another side quest here. But if you are interested, you guys can always check out the work by Richie Davidson, who's been studying meditators for decades. And I believe there's over 600 publications under his name. And he studied meditators, advanced meditators with functional MRI. And in general, I can give you the really quick recap of all his work. But he discovered that absolutely we can say that meditators can do things which we can measure with functional MRI that regular people can't do. For example, their response, they can actually, for lack of a better term, turn off their emotional response as measured by a functional MRI to disturbing imagery. So he would show a bunch of people disturbing imagery, he would prime them, discover what is actually disturbing to them, and then he would observe that in normal people, you have this crazy thing happening in the brain after they see it, and it just kind of lingers. And with experienced meditators, they just kind of turn it off. They see it, the visual cortex lights up, they can see the image. Even the emotional impact is there, so they can feel the whatever first wave of what happens to you when you see a disturbing image happen. But after that, it just dies out. And they do this on command. So they understand something about the architecture of the inner experience that unless you devote your life to it or unless you practice it, you don't know how to do. So is it not just, well, just like the slide says, different modalities all studying the world? But do they flow into one another? Is there a connection between those that can be practical? And can it, in fact, bring something about that wasn't there before? Because to me, the tail sign of no matter how crazy an idea is, the real measurement of its success is whether or not you can actually do something with it. So if you can achieve, if you're using, there's many theories and approaches in physics, but those are tools to do different things. So if a tool that we developed in physics can actually do something we couldn't do before, well, that's a successful tool. The validity of its ultimate truth is not as important as the fact that it allows us to do this thing now that we couldn't do before. And I would say that, the one side of the story, i.e. the question, can science proper inform inner experience in such a way that makes it better? I think the answer is clearly yes. I'm sure that some people might disagree, but I do think that ultimately whatever is true of us and true of the universe can be touched on by science the way we're doing it today. So, in order to build neural links, you need some understanding through science, right? And maybe even we can accelerate or circumvent some processes that we have to go through in order to reach what the contemplatives would call enlightenment. But I would say that the same should be clearly true the other way around. If you are really experienced meditators, there's many things, clarity of mind, many things that scientists would like to have on board if they are to be really good scientists. Clarity of mind, concentration, the ability to not be hijacked by your emotions and therefore being too biased in any direction. You can't eradicate bias entirely, but I would submit to you that somebody who's really good at meditating, they're not as attached to any proposition. So actually, you can run in pretty wild directions in terms of ideas that you might have, and you have to worry a lot less about getting lost in your own ideas because you can just cast it away the second you discover it has no validity. And I would even submit that, and this is slightly a little bit harder to swallow, but I do think that if we do see ourselves as the kind of thing in the universe that can understand things to universal degrees, I do think that the kind of tool that we are can potentially determine the kinds of things we can discover. In other words, if we look at the world in a particular way, it might tell us things about itself that we couldn't have possibly noticed otherwise. I'm going to try and run through these a little bit faster because I'm very aware of time and I don't want to pass the 1 hour mark for our talk. So if you guys don't know, what the Buddha's proposition was is that, in fact, there is this one universal law of being, and that is essentially the result of which is what karma is. Karma is not a form of punishment of any kind. It's simply the state of affairs. It means that when you do something, every action has an opposite and equal reaction. And that's exactly what happens also in the state of being, only the Buddha actually didn't make any distinction between those two. His claim was that this universal law is applicable to everything, including everything that is what we call physical. Now, that's a big claim. I'm not claiming to know the answer to this, but I can tell you as a longtime meditator that the Buddha definitely understood something about what is possible for human beings and how we can live in more harmony with ourselves and the world in a systematic way. And then the question becomes, is there any credence to his claim? Are the laws of physics just another way of seeing this one universal law? In fact, if we look at it from the perspective of the most mainstream physics, it is what's postulated with the Big Bang theory, right? And again, I know that because everybody here are physicists, or most people here are physicists, people have all kinds of emotions about these, theories that may or may not be your favorite. But it's not crazy to assume that all laws of physics emanates from one proto-law of some sort, and it's just a matter of looking at it from different levels of emergence with different energy levels, right? So I'm totally okay with postulating that there are these inescapable truths that would be equivalent to what the Buddha called the universal law and what we call the laws of physics, which is simply the state of affairs of the world the way we find it. And really, no matter how, even if we discover there's something behind the laws of physics, or it's all computation or whatever, you never escape the fact that whatever that is, this is what I call the container problem, which is just a generalized, it's the most generalized way I can think of, the infinite regress of the question itself, which is like we're looking for this theory of everything, but, well, some people do. But really, it will always suffer from the container problem. Because no matter how far you go, you can always say, well, what is that in? And I don't mean just spatially. I mean like in any possible way you can imagine. And so I'm totally okay with stopping at a certain point and say, okay, this is just how the world, the way we find it right now, and it's the best we can say. And clearly there's a distinction between that and what I call escapable truths, which would be the equivalent of environmental pressure and how life deals with it, which is depending of the environment, life would kind of go through these, well, it happens the other way around, but you get what I'm saying. There's life can survive in basically almost every single place that it's possible to be. And that would be much more of an escapable truth. You can actually overcome it. And the equivalent of that on the human experience side would be the local moral frames. So we can say, well, this is how the norm in this particular culture, let's say, right? But it is quite distinct from maybe some ethical codes that we can talk about that potentially are universal. Here's a simple one. Hitting another being on the head really hard with a rock for no reason whatsoever is universally wrong. Why? Because it's not adding anything. It lowers the quality of experience for, I would say, both beings. So it's not that I'm not trying to get into a deep philosophical discussion, but I do think that there are equivalences here. And the reason that this, I think, is important is because I'm trying to find something that I think that we can say with some amount of confidence that does resemble some higher function that is happening from the universe in us. Because currently, a lot of scientists kind of assume from the physicalist perspective that we're just kind of a small, tiny, very thinly smeared layer on top of a much more grand machinery that is the universe. And it's not necessarily wrong to assume that we're just a tiny speck of everything that's going on, of course. But I think that the picture is slightly off. And the thing that I think is more obvious, which is that whatever it is that we're experiencing as our own experience from the inside, must have some components of that in existence itself. We came from it. There's no matter and then things on top of matter. There's something that is happening, and it's all happening at once. So finally, we're kind of arriving at what we are doing in Code of Reality. I started an organization called Code of Reality, and yes, it is the name. We are being a little cheeky with the name, obviously, to be super clear to anybody who's wants to raise the issue of you guys really think this is the Code of Reality. What I found, no, we have no idea. We have no idea what we're looking at the laser. All we know is that that thing is basically behaves like almost any regular object you're going to be looking at, aside from one component, which is you can't touch it, or at least not yet, as far as we know. So Code of Reality is basically the organization that I created. It's a nonprofit, and we are collecting technically minded people from all over the world. We have a couple of physicists on board. We have a software engineer. We have a cryptographer, a brain scan expert so far, and we're slowly growing. And the questions that we're posing is, okay, well, we're seeing this Code of Reality, which we assume to be fundamental. It's an assumption, but there's good reasons to think that at this point. We observe it. We exchange our ideas for it. Okay, Google, stop. We exchange those ideas with one another, so we run it through the network of the human tapestry. And then we try to connect it to something that we understand about the world. This is what we call cognitive physics. The difference between regular physics and cognitive physics is only one, which is that we do not remove ourselves as an observer from the picture, but we try in every which way to include what is the instance of our observation in terms of content, not just in terms of what are we doing to the particle, and then what is there anything to be said about the fact that what we're seeing is coherent to a conscious being like ourselves. And we're not removing that question from the equation. We're actually directly looking at that question. And that kind of leads me to the question of what are we? If we are the kind of thing that can see the world in this way that allows us to reformulate the world in pretty novel ways, what does that mean in universal terms? Even if you believe that we are an arising property in the universe and we're not fundamental, or consciousness is not fundamental, you still have to admit that whatever humans do, at least in this corner of the universe, seems to be very unique. And what is this uniqueness? What is it? What can we say about that uniqueness? I'm sure most of you are familiar with David Deutsch. And again, this is not a political conversation. So if anybody has issues specifically with Deutsch, I personally think he did incredible work. And I'm sure you guys are familiar with Chiara Marletto, who together they developed constructor theory. And the general concept, again, I'm sure most people are familiar, but just to run it through you, is basically it's a reframing of not just a new way to look at the problems we already know. It's a new way to look at the world as a whole. So the question becomes not so much, can we reduce what we're observing in terms of the most fundamental things that are giving rise to that thing? So, reductionism, essentially. Is there a way to look at the world in which we just ask the question, what transformations are possible and what transformations are impossible, according to what we observe and know about the laws of physics? And I think it's a quite profound question to ask, because what it does, it it allows for science to become even more universal than what it is. Because I would submit, and this is Deutsch's point, and I do think it's correct, which is that asking the question only in terms of spin, momentum, and everything we do in physics seems to be marrying ourselves to one modality of observation when other modalities might actually yield a much more concrete fruit in whatever it is that we're trying to study. And also what it does is that it removes this limitation of if something is not what we call fundamental, so if it's not something that, if it's something that is an arising property, it does not mean that it cannot become part of the tapestry of fundamentality. In other words, if, for example, you believe that the world is just physical and humans are just an arising property of the universe, whatever it is that is doing, well, you still have to contend with the fact that if humans, if we don't destroy ourselves, which is, of course, a big if, there's no promises, but if we don't, we seem to be able to recapitulate the laws of physics in our labs in such a way that we can target these. So we not only understand the laws of physics, we can also construct new things in the universe that would not be possible without the kind of thing that we are formulating that information, processing it, and then constructing new structures in the universe. And give it enough time, just like everything we have around us in the human world right now was in somebody's mind at some point, our imagination would literally paint the galaxy. That's not an exaggeration to say. So I think that this reformulation is very helpful because if we know something to be possible, we are at liberty to ask, what does that mean about the ultimate state of affairs of the universe? As extravagant as that sounds. And under that, core code of reality is asking, what tasks does reality permit here with where we are now? And another side point is the cognitive physics asks what it would become in the process of finding out. Because the thing that I'm trying to convey more than anything else is that whenever I'm presented with all the beautiful questions that people email me, and some of you guys emailed me as well, they're very valid concerns and pushbacks about methodology, about why I think it's justified to say that something is real when we never probed it with a physical material. All of these are legitimate concerns, but what I want to maybe open the window to is this other potential observation that there might, until the moment that we do find a way to probe it in ways that we're more comfortable with, until that moment comes, maybe it might actually be fruitful to look at ourselves as the universal constructor, the universal explainer that we are, and ask, what inner states of being should we entertain of playing with to potentially be able to understand something much deeper about what we call the physical external world? And we don't have to get lost in that, by the way. There's still a very clear-cut, woven path for us to stay on that is not woo-woo, that is not crazy, that is not, non-rigorous. All of these things are still very much intact in these frames. And I guess I'm just using Deutsch and Chiara as an example of, well, at least some people who have some clout that do think about these things in this way. Another quick thing that I want to mention is that if you guys are not familiar, just in general, with the work of Michael Levine, or Levin, I'm not sure how to pronounce it correctly, but if you're not familiar, it's quite fascinating. He's basically revolutionizing biology currently. And what he discovered, there's quite a few things he discovered, but he basically found a way to interact with a bioelectrical signature of some sort that records some kind of a vector space that is not in the genetic code. And again, I highly recommend you guys check out his work. But here's a perfect example of how he discovered this. So one of the things they did in a lab is that they took a planaria, which is a type of a worm, and one of the things that it does is that if you cut it in half, it's one of these things that just kind of becomes two, right? So it has this mechanism. And what he discovered is that if you play with this bioelectrical signature, you if you give it the command, the software level command, to have a head on each side, so instead of a head and a tail, if you're going to have a head on both sides, if you then cut it in half, in other words, that's part of its evolution, all of its offsprings would do the same. But here's the crazy part. They didn't change anything about the genetic code. So it was not passed down through the genes. It's not in the hardware. It's somewhere in the software. And in fact, another example they did is that they took I forget what creature they used it from, but it was some other creature that can regrow limbs, and they put that software, I'm just calling it, software as a heuristic, but they put that software in types of frogs who then regrew the limb. But the architecture of the frog is completely different than this other being. And yet, all the offsprings of that frog will now be able to regrow that limb. So now that means that something is being passed down on some medium that isn't the genetic code. Now, I know that in IPI, people are very open-minded about, simulation theory and all that stuff, but we're starting to see examples in the world that are very clearly showing us that there are these other ways of observing what we thought we already understood very well that allows us to do something we couldn't before. Michael is a perfect example of someone who's reframing the way we're viewing everything. He's famous for always saying everything is placebo. Everything. When you're regulating certain chemical processes in the morning when you wake up, just by the fact that you're aware of being you, that is placebo. That is the effect of what we are as whatever it is that cognition is, and a direct translation or response, or maybe an expression of, in terms of what we see as the vector space that we ultimately call our physical body. And this is another perfect example of how reframing how we view this in small ways can actually allow us, it frees us to do certain things, even in harder sciences, that we couldn't do before. And I'll finish with this. This is obviously not new to anyone here because, again, everybody, I would assume everybody are on board to some degree with the simulation theory. Maybe not, but we can talk about it. But if you guys are not familiar, this is No Man's Sky. It's a game. And one of the things they basically figured out how to do is to create these enormous amounts of different worlds, over 18 quintillion. And all of these, by the way, are, so if I go visit your planet, it's the same planet. It's not like you're just playing in your own little sandbox. And so this is just to all the people that say, how can we ever possibly think about, other civilizations simulating worlds? It's impossible. There's all this computational hiccups and all of that stuff. I mean, yeah, we can do it now. This is not a problem. And then the point that I was trying to drive here is basically, yeah, if we connect all of these, if we go from Michael and the way he's reframing his view of biology and what's possible to do there, the fact that we know that we are doing things today that giving us the glimmers, the hints that that in fact these, we can create infinite worlds. Is it really that crazy to think that our universe is essentially part of a much larger computational system? And maybe finish with a bit of a novelty here. This is, I will freely admit that this is a bit of a platitude, but I do believe this strongly, that our mission is how do we create a balanced world that cares about nature, humans, the future, as well as rigor and rules of evidence. So we don't compromise the first-person experience for the sake of productivity and advances in science, but we also don't throw away the beauty of what we created with science that gave us this really comfortable and beautiful world. How do we merge the two? And that's even a little bit more of a novelty. This is kind of like my vision of the future, where we are the gardeners of the galaxy. We go and we use technology to expand and explore, but at the same time, we are, every place we arrive, we connect to it. We love being a part of it. We are the custodians of what I would call divine knowledge. And fully aware of how this must come across as this overly loaded idea. But I think that these kind of visions are really important to connect us to something a little deeper and more transcendent, something that would actually allow us to really be excited about the future. And all of this is only possible because, and this is where we're gonna talk about this in the Q&A. If you guys have questions, I know that most of the questions are going to be about the code and the laser. This is why I didn't even bother to mention it too much in the talk. I figured I'll just smuggle my ideas in. But it's only possible because, and the reason that so many serious people all around the world are now entering our little bubble and starting really asking real questions is because I do believe we found something that is about to fundamentally change everything we understand about the world, not from a theoretical perspective, but from a direct observational perspective, to which we then would have to apply all of our tools, the scientific rigor and our inner space of spiritual growth. And I would say, I will just finish with this. I think that the way we should expand the definition of science is that capital S science is the enterprise of understanding. Full stop. The modalities should be open-ended. That's our team. Can't go without promotion. Veil break. By the way, if you guys, so the Code of Reality website, thank you, Melvin, for mentioning it. It's on purpose kind of in a not very advanced mode because there's a lot of requests we're getting that we can't really, we don't have the manpower currently to abide by a certain level that we have to be able to deliver if the website is going to look amazing. But what I do encourage you guys to do, if you want to check it out, we just developed something called veilbreak.ai. So you can go to veilbreak.ai, and it is basically a website that allows anybody to contribute specifically to the experiments. They can watch other people's experiments. They can fork the experiments that were already done. They can do all of this anonymously, so they don't have to put their names or anything like this. And this is our way of collecting data and exchanging ideas. And now we're going to go to the Q&A. I do have a few more things here that are, I'm leaving it for the Q&A because they are a lot more an exploration that I would be happy to bounce it off of you guys. But this is as far as I want to go in our main talk. Thank you so much, everybody.